And it's on the phone, I'm selling $58,000. Yeah.
The auction was music to the ears of a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center in the Caribbean. The reformed alcoholic and heroin addict co-founded the Crossroads Center in Antigua. It's getting a $1.7 million boost from the auction of more than 70 of the rock legend's guitars. But the lucky buyers may need a guitar lesson or two to play anything like the guitar god, as his many fans describe him. This is Al Jazeera, and these are the stories making headlines. After weeks of protests calling for change in Yemen, the president has just announced a transition to what he calls a parliamentary system. After 32 years in power, Ali Abdullah Saleh has also announced plans to form a new constitution. But our correspondent in Sano says some opposition members say it's too little, too late.
When I spoke with the opposition about whether they are going to attend this gathering, they said, no, it's too late. Ali Abdullah Saleh stands for an old regime. He has to go. He has to understand that all the reforms that he is trying to offer are too little, too late.
State television in Libya has broadcast what it says are confessions of members of a criminal terrorist group linked to Al-Qaeda. Colonel Gaddafi has blamed Al-Qaeda groups for starting the uprising in Libya. The blindfolded men are said to have been arrested in Ras Lanuf. Now, in that town, Ras Lanuf, forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi struck at rebels and oil installations. Dozens of people are reported to have been killed there and in other cities in the country. The Kremlin has announced a ban on Russian weapons sales to Libya. Moscow has signed $2 billion worth of contracts with another $1.8 billion warplane and missile deal in the pipeline. Senior representatives from Gaddafi's government have been sent to Egypt, Portugal and Belgium on a series of diplomatic missions. Their objective is still unclear. The Dalai Lama has announced he'll be stepping down from his role as the political head of Tibet's exiled movement. He says it's time for a freely elected leader to take over. Authorities in Egypt have made a number of arrests after armed men attacked demonstrators in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Pro-reform protesters say supporters of the ousted President Hosni Mubarak used knives, machetes and rocks against the protesters who were camped in the square. The government has promised an investigation into the incident. In Côte d'Ivoire, cocoa bean exporters have been ordered to get back to work or their stock will be seized. The disputed president, Laurent Gbagbo, wants to reverse an export ban imposed by his presidential rival, Alassane Ouattara. Those are the latest headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after Riz Khan. And a reminder that you can keep up to date with all the news on our website at aljazeera.net/English.
Hello and welcome. Has it become normal for Americans to fear Muslims as fanatics? And if so, what has driven this blind prejudice and intolerance? Could there actually be some foundation for those fears based on the repeated actions of extremists in the United States?
As a matter of fact, I know quite a few Marines who will be very happy to help these terrorists to an early meeting in paradise.
The most popular name in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, this was in the news this week, for babies this year was Muhammad. Am I a racist to feel I'm alarmed by that? Because I am.
Islam is a violent, I would say religion, but it's not a religion. It's a political system. It's a violent political system bent on the overthrow of the governments of the world and world domination.
Well, for the first time in U.S. history, at least 15 states have either approved or introduced bills banning Sharia law, the Islamic legal code. In Tennessee, a proposed bill could make it a felony, punishable by up to 15 years in jail, for Muslims to perform everyday religious practices like praying, giving to charity or fasting, because that would be defined as banned Sharia practices. Also on Thursday, congressional hearings will start looking at the so-called radicalization of Muslims in the U.S. So on today's show we ask, has the American Muslim community become the target of a political witch hunt in the post-9/11 era? Remember, you can join our conversation by sending an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, joining us from California is the renowned Muslim intellectual Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. After the 9/11 attacks in the US, Sheikh Hamza emerged as a respected Islamic scholar advising both the White House and the Arab League. In recent years, he's focused his teachings on countering the widening gap between the Muslim world and the West. He's also the founder and chairman of the Zaytuna Institute based in California. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, good to have you on the show again.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Well, first of all, I want to refer to those sound bites from the opening of the show. You heard there a number of people, obviously some clear prejudices there, and I wonder, what is it that allows people in the US to talk about Islam in this way, and yet if it had been any other religion they'd been talking about, there would have been quite an outcry?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think Bill Maher on a regular basis says things that anybody else, had they said them about any other group, say, for instance, Jews or blacks or other minorities or even religious groups, they would have lost their job by now. But I think it shows you the extent of the acceptable nature of just being anti-Arab, being anti-Muslim. So, you know, unfortunately, it's deeply disturbing for those of us who have families who, for instance, many people's wives wear traditional clothing when they go out, or at least a head covering with Western style clothing. But increasingly we're seeing this antagonism in the United States, and I think it's a result of many now since 9/11 it's been just unrelenting attacks on talk radio, an incredible number of books that have come out against Islam. One of the things, and I think Pat Robertson displayed that in his statement just now, that this idea that Islam somehow is an ideology, that it's a political system as opposed to being a world religion. And I think 1,400 years of Islamic history completely denies that ridiculous assumption.
Let me get an email to you, if I may, that came in from South Africa, from Cape Town. And Cameron Peter wrote in saying, have Muslims replaced the Cold War communist bogeyman in the American psyche?
You know, it's a good point. I think there was a book written, John Stockwell, a former CIA operative, wrote a book called In Search of Enemies. And one of the things that we've noted in the United States is, despite the declining purchasing power of the dollar, despite the spiraling debt, the one sacred cow of the American deficit or budget is military spending, and military spending is actually at Cold War numbers, and if you adjust it for inflation, it's quite stunning what's happened, and that's all been justified by the war on terror. More people died in the United States last year from dog bites than died from terrorist attacks. Less than 3 people. Many of these attacks, in fact, according to the FBI, are actually done by fundamentalist Christians against abortion doctors and things like that. So I think there's just an immense overblown aspect to this whole thing that to me is deeply troubling, because I think things get very distorted. They call it the media magnifying glass that can really distort a threat or distort some statistical insignificance out there into something very significant.
Now, of course, we've got 15 states here in the US targeting Sharia law. What do you see